Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sutner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I am here to kind of host and guide and get your questions to our top scholar who's joining us today, Tom Donnelly. So today's topic is the civil rights movement. We're going to definitely look at the Warren Court and some landmark cases. Tom, I think my favorite part of this class is we get to meet so many people and so many organizations. And I think that's the coolest part of this class, is that you get to understand how these different organizations worked, what were their goals, who were their people, and then how did they all work together in a constellation of strategy to change the Constitution and to move the civil rights movement forward. So that's just my big love of this class. Tom, anything that you're super excited before we jump into this topic?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it, is the people and the organizations. It's more broadly how this, also the civil rights movement story talks about how important it is for there to be coordination between what's happening on the ground, what's happening in the courts, what's happening in Congress, and what's happening at the presidency, and how all of those institutions pushing together are often necessary to create big constitutional change.
Awesome. And I think that's really smart, not just to understand how much work it took, but also when we're thinking about constitutional change in the future, getting all those players together to work together to be aligned is hugely important. So we laugh when we talk about this class because we always start off with big questions on the topics. And this one, I think we ran out of space, okay. So like bring us from the beginning all the way home. So what's the big idea of the civil rights movement? Explain to us, Tom, a little bit about the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but also that people reference the civil rights movement and something longer than the 1950s and 60s, but then walk us all the way through to the civil rights era, the Warren Court, and the big changes to the Constitution. So I'll let you start with the big idea and kind of walk us through the big concepts of civil rights movements over time, and then we'll dive into the 50s and 60s.
Absolutely. So the big idea here is that, when we look at America's founding documents, things like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they broadly promise freedom and equality to everyone. What we know is that for many years, we did not live up to that promise as a nation. And so the story we're telling today of the civil rights movement is the story not just of the 50s and 60s, but of generations upon generations upon generations of Americans, looking at those documents for inspiration and also turning towards those documents like the Declaration and the Constitution to sort of hold a mirror up to the nation and demand that America do better, to live up to its ideals. And so it's with, especially culminating in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and beyond, the story is this story of this push towards greater freedom and equality over time. But as we know, it required hard work, it required sacrifice, it required courage, bodily courage throughout this history. And that's why we're going to try to teach you about so many of the different courageous people and organizations that fought for this constitutional change.
And so such a good point. Courage in mind, in body, putting themselves on the line in every sense of the way for years and years to see change, and maybe not in their lifetime. So let's start with the NAACP. This is a name that a lot of students have heard. They hear it in the news, they hear it today. But when did it start? Who started it? And what was its goal?
Yeah, so as we go through these different organizations, one thing we'll see immediately is while the civil rights movement that we think of in our heads most clearly is in the 50s and 60s, we can see even from these organizations that the story extends back decades upon decades further. So the first big organization we're going to talk about is the NAACP. It's founded in 1909. And we can see here the inspiring charter. The mission of the NAACP was to, quote, promote equality of rights and eradicate caste or race prejudice among citizens of the United States. So the NAACP, it's calling for equality at the ballot box, in the courts, in our schools, at work, and those inspiring words at the end that you see for complete equality before the law. The NAACP has a series of great heroes associated with it, beginning with Ida B. Wells, who you see in the lower left-hand corner there. She was a courageous journalist and civil rights figure, and she studied white violence in the South in the late 1890s and through into the early 1900s. So a lot of what we know about violence against African Americans comes from Ida B. Wells's trailblazing and courageous work. If you go up to the upper left-hand corner, we see W.E.B. Du Bois. He is one of the leading intellectuals in American history. He was the first African American to get a PhD at Harvard. He also wrote one of the pioneering works on the history of Reconstruction. So that's that period after the Civil War where we tried to bring America back together on stronger constitutional baselines. He wrote a book called Black Reconstruction, which placed African Americans at the absolute center of that story. So that's Du Bois. We also see Mary White Ovington, who was a suffragist and a journalist. She was a key early figure in the NAACP. And then finally, we have Moorfield Story, who was a lawyer from Boston and a founding president of the organization from 1909 to 1929. So that's the NAACP.
And I just had to show this book because it's big. Don't let it scare you. It is so good, people. If you're going to I have Eric Foner and W. Bois together sitting on the table. I like to keep them together as two sides of that story, two great resources. We love books. We love sharing books. That's been our theme for the last 6 months. So the next one is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
So this is the SCLC. It was founded in 1957, and its central tenet is nonviolence. Nonviolence. So this is the organization that's most famously associated with Martin Luther King. But there are other important figures associated with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, including Ella Baker. So she's a figure. She had a 5-decade-long career. She was a behind-the-scenes operator. What she really pushed for were two big things within the civil rights movement. One, she wanted to make sure that the movement was grassroots up, not just top down. So she really focused on the grassroots. She also pushed to make sure that there were plenty of women at the head of leadership in the civil rights movement. So it wasn't just a male-dominated, male-headed organization, but a movement that had important voices that were women. We also see Ralph Abernathy, who was a Baptist minister, a close friend and mentor to Dr. King. He worked with Dr. King on the Montgomery bus boycott. And he also became the president of the organization after Dr. King's tragic assassination. And then finally, we have Fred Shuttlesworth, who was a minister from Birmingham and an important ally of Dr. King. And then also we have Bayard Rustin, who was this amazing figure. He was a trailblazer of nonviolent direct action. He taught Dr. King many of those principles, but he wasn't just a theoretician. He was a great practical operator too. He helped organize the Freedom Rides and also the March on Washington.
And talk about strategy, and the brain of Bayard Rustin is unbelievable, figuring out how to get nearly 1 million people into Washington, D.C. and back out and safely out of Washington, D.C. within 24 hours. This is his brilliance. So there's so many layers of brilliance to these people, that their strategy in the moral beliefs, in the speaking roles, and in just the movement of people for these marches was unbelievable. I'm just blown away over and over again, the multi-skills that it took to push this through. Now, the Congress for Racial Equality is another big group that we should know. Yeah, so it's often known as CORE. It was formed in 1942, and it had a really broad vision of equality. You could see it right there, to bring equality for all people regardless of race, creed, sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, religion, or ethnic background. Some of its key figures are James Farmer, who was a main practitioner of nonviolent direct action. He organized the first Freedom Ride. We have George Hauser, who was a Methodist minister. And then we have Bernice Fisher, who was based in Chicago, and she was known as the godmother of the sit-in movement. Sit-in movement, unbelievably huge and made such impacts. Now, the next group is Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Yeah, so LCCR, it was founded in 1950. Now, we coordinated a lot of action at the national level. So when you think of the civil rights movement, you think of really big laws passed, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. LCCR was right at the center of all of that lobbying and national action. And frankly, it still plays a huge role in the civil rights community today. It remains a really, really important organization. Some of its key figures are Roy Wilkins, who was active from the 1930s all the way up through the 1970s. There's A. Philip Randolph, who you can see in the middle there. He was an important labor organizer. And Arnold Aronson, there in the bottom right, he was the executive secretary of the organization from 1950 to 1980. And so we worked with Randolph to lobby FDR to ensure that there were some protections for civil rights during the New Deal era. And he also helped plan the March on Washington. Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. I feel like this is the one that I knew, probably other than NAACP, the most. And some of the reason why is we see a lot of their figures, John Lewis being one of them, as the younger kind of level of the civil rights movement. So they had more interaction with us as adults, that we knew them in the field and they weren't just stories from the past, but they were still active.
Absolutely. So yeah, this is signaling generational change. These are the really young people involved in the civil rights movement. It's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committees, also known as SNCC, which is easier to say than its full name. It was founded in April of 1960. It grew out of the sit-in movement. And we see here a figure we already talked about. Ella Baker was a key figure in helping to bring together SNCC, and she got SNCC to focus on two big goals. One was to really make sure that they were doing nonviolent direct action. That was one branch. But the other is that she urged her allies in SNCC to not forget about the vote, to continue to push for voter registration, because that is the key to political power. Baker would then help support and teach that generation of leadership. People like Diane Nash, Julian Bond, you've already mentioned, John Lewis Curry, Stokely Carmichael, Bob Moses, Bernice Johnson Reagan. These are all people who played key roles in the civil rights movement and have legacies well beyond that. John Lewis, probably the most famous of all of these figures, but everyone that we see on this screen played a key role in pushing for this constitutional revolution we saw during the civil rights movement.
And during our class, probably like 3 months ago, Professor Jeffries came and he on the Friday class and walked through, I know he talked about Diane Nash, but he walked through some of these key figures. So we can send you that video as well in the wrap up of the week, so you can dive deeper into some of these people. And then next is the Committee for Equal Justice. And we see some major, strong female leaders over the long haul. These women are in it for a long-term commitment to making change in our country.
Yeah, the Committee for Equal Justice, founded by Rosa Parks and Recy Taylor in 1944, it focused on equality specifically for African-American women. So Rosa Parks, famous for not giving up her bus seat, that famous episode in 1955, she was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP for 14 years. So she was a very active figure in the civil rights movement more broadly. Recy Taylor was raised in the Jim Crow South in Alabama, and both of them formed the Committee for Racial Justice, for Equal Justice, rather, to ensure that really we placed a spotlight on violence, especially against African-American women.
Awesome. And real quick, before we jump in, and now in a minute, we're gonna go through that timeline to see when did civil rights really begin in this country, and move it all the way up, and we'll end at the Warren Court. So before we do that timeline move, would you introduce us to another key player in this, and that's the Warren Court?
Yeah, so this is the Supreme Court. It's named after the figure right there, Chief Justice Earl Warren. It ran from 1953 to 1969, and it played a huge role during the civil rights era. So this is the court that brought us Brown versus Board of Education, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. But this is a period in which the Supreme Court really emerged as an ally of the civil rights movement. We may not think that this is a big deal throughout American history, but really, if you're looking at all of Supreme Court history, for much of its history, the Supreme Court was no ally of civil rights reformers. And this really changes in important ways with the Warren Court, with Chief Justice Warren and his colleagues carving out an important role for the Supreme Court in protecting minority rights, and especially the rights of unpopular groups like African Americans were in many parts of the United States during the civil rights movement. So we see here the Supreme Court taking on this more modern role of protecting equality and individual rights, especially for minorities.
Awesome. Now, this isn't something, the fight for civil rights isn't something that we just see happen in the 1950s in our country. We see it throughout our entire history. So, we're going to rewind a little and start with the document that calls for being treated equally, that all men are created equal, and we hold these true self-evident. So Tom, give us that foundation in the Declaration, and then walk us through the players from the Declaration on that called for us to live up to these values that we put in our Declaration and eventually in our Constitution.
Yeah, so this is America's founding creed from the Declaration of Independence. Worth reading, even though you know it, because it's so powerful. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the one thing to emphasize here is that these are the values that are written in America's DNA. So this is the American creed, and what we see over time are generations upon generations of reformers draw on that language of the Declaration of Independence to push for a better America and push for the ways in which we can transform America's Constitution. We see this from the very beginning. As early as 1777, right after the Declaration of Independence, we see Prince Hall, who's a free African-American in Massachusetts, petitioning the Massachusetts legislature, saying that slavery is inconsistent with the Declaration of Independence. Massachusetts, abolish this practice. So we see Prince Hall right there in 1777. But as we get into the 1800s, we see key figures like Frederick Douglass, similarly turning to the Declaration of Independence, challenging his white audience to live up to the words of their founding creed and its promise of freedom and equality for everyone. And these pushes continue all the way into the 20th century. And in one of the most famous speeches in the 20th century, Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, he referred to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as a promissory note issued to all Americans, regardless of this race and of their race. And so we see the Declaration of Independence becomes an ideal for the nation to live up to, but also an instrument for reformers to push for ways in which we can transform America to live up to those founding promises of freedom and equality.
So when we're thinking about founding documents and the call for us to live up to what we write down on parchment, we can think of the Declaration of Independence, and like you said, you can hear it in these speeches, hear it in these calls. But then we also need to look to the Constitution, because it's not in the Constitution, it's in there as well. And it starts with those three beautiful little words, we the people. But then during the 1860s and 1870s, it is even more embodied with the promise of equality. So walk us through where in the Constitution we can call to the civil rights of all people.
Yeah, so civil rights reformers, they frequently look to the preamble, this promise of government by we the people, that we the people are in charge, and that we the people include all of the people, regardless of race, gender, creed, anything else. But then also you can many reformers point to the promises written into the Constitution after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, wrote the Declaration of Independence's promise of freedom and equality into the Constitution. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, banned racial discrimination in voting. And then all of these amendments together also had what were called enforcement clauses, which means that these amendments also gave the national government, specifically Congress, the power to realize the promise written into those amendments. And so reformers, as they're pushing up against Jim Crow segregation and this system, especially throughout the South, of treating African Americans as second-class citizens, what civil rights reformers could often do is hold up the Declaration of Independence, hold up the Constitution, and say that this system of Jim Crow segregation is inconsistent with American values, our core principles, our founding documents, that we, the civil rights reformers, we are on the side of America and the ideals we're supposed to be living up to, and you are the enemies of these ideals.
Awesome, fantastic. And just a little quick change there. It's 1865. I just wanted to say that out loud so we got the date right. Okay, two other amendments. So the 23rd and the 24th Amendment also are in the Constitution, and they nod to this idea to ensure that you have what Ella Baker said is unbelievably important, the power in the vote and the power of the vote.
Yeah, so the 23rd Amendment's ratified in 1961. It grants the District of Columbia and its African-American population 3 electoral votes, and so it added their voices to the presidential selection process. And then with the 24th Amendment, it's ratified in 1964. It bans poll taxes in national elections. So you're right, Curry, these are two amendments that focus on the link between civil rights and voting.
Awesome. So now let's dive into this a little bit closer, and let's start looking at kind of the vote and the courts around this as well. Because it doesn't just, as you said earlier, the courts aren't always on the side of civil rights. So let's examine the courts over time and kind of look at where the courts are leading up to the Warren Court, and what a pivotal moment of change that Warren Court really is. I think without having that context, it feels like, oh, okay, cool, we did this. But understanding kind of the big difference in change over time is really important. So do you want to dive into it, starting in PLESSY, and then move from there? Does that sound like a good start, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we have this period. We ratified the 14th Amendment in 1868. We have a bursting, actually, of interracial, multiracial democracy in America for a certain number of years, where we have African Americans voting in massive numbers, holding office in massive numbers. But then after all too brief a period, this period of Reconstruction collapses. It's replaced by Jim Crow segregation, the system that separates African Americans from white Americans, that limits the voting rights of African Americans through a mix of violence, intimidation, and laws. And so this entire system is put in place. And in Plessy versus Ferguson, the question is this system of Jim Crow segregation consistent with the Constitution? Is it consistent with the 14th Amendment's promise of equality? And in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court, in a lopsided 7-1 decision, says yes, Jim Crow segregation is constitutional. It doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. And this is where we get this doctrine of separate but equal, the idea that it's okay to separate the races as long as the facilities are equal. Of course, there is a 1 in Plessy v. Ferguson, and there's a powerful dissent by Justice John Marshall Harlan. What we see are decades upon decades of Jim Crow segregation that's been green-lighted by the Supreme Court, which is the frame for Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education. Oh, I'm sorry, Carrie.
Oh, no, that's perfect. I was like, roll right into it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's in many ways the most famous decision in the history of the Supreme Court. It grows out of decades upon decades of work inside the courts by this amazing trio of lawyers and their allies in the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, William Hastie. They build up case after case, chipping away at Jim Crow segregation over time. And it ends up culminating in the big challenge of Brown versus Board of Education, where finally, after years and years of litigation, they decide, we're going to go after segregation in the public school system. And that case turns on this girl, Linda Brown. She's a 3rd grader. And what does she want? She and her parents just want for her to go to the school that's nearest to her house, the public school there, the Sumner School. But the school system says, no, Linda, you can't attend our school because you're an African American and our school is an all-white school. So there's the system of segregation. But ultimately, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision authored by Chief Justice Earl Warren, says, you know what? We, the court, got it wrong in Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson was wrong on the day it was decided. Linda Brown's parents, you are right. This system of segregation in our schools is inconsistent with the 14th Amendment's promise of equality. It's unconstitutional. So the court overrules Plessy v. Ferguson. And here's the powerful words from Chief Justice Warren. He says that we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
And so, Tom, you read these powerful words, you hear this, it's unfair, it's unjust, it's unconstitutional, it's non-equal. We need to change this. This is overturned. We are going to make change. But you don't see that change happen right away. It takes a long time, and another court, Brown versus Board of Ed 2, that to really make that change. So kind of thinking and leading up to that, let's have a conversation around the heroes, the very young heroes, again, like Linda Brown, teenagers fighting to follow the court and follow the law and desegregate schools. So can you tell us a little bit about the Little Rock Nine?
Absolutely. So Brown's in 1954. Right after Brown, we see what's known as massive resistance throughout the South to the decision. And so we see, political leaders and school systems continuing to try to fight for segregation in the schools. And this push leads to a crisis point in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 African-American students, the Little Rock Nine, attempt to enroll at the all-white Central High School. Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas calls up the National Guard to bar them from entering with the support of white mobs. President Eisenhower then sends 1,000 national troops. He nationalizes the Arkansas National Guard to protect the African-American students. And in a powerful speech, Eisenhower addresses the nation, explaining his decision. And then finally, the Warren Court steps in to reinforce the president's actions in Cooper v. Aaron in 1958. There, the court explained that state officers and governors, they have a duty to obey the orders of the court, whether they like them or not. And so there we see again, Curry, this combination of the courts acting, and the president having to step in, and the courts reinforcing what the president has done. And so different institutional actors moving together with the civil rights movement to push for change. But of course, we know we're a far ways. Much more has to happen to ensure freedom and equality in America.
And I think that's so important. It leads us perfectly to our next person. There's constant pressure, constant moving, constant resistance going on through the entire country from the African American community. And we talk about Rosa Parks, and we know that she is the woman who sat on the bus most famously for it, but did unbelievably so much. And this is in 1955. We have Rosa Parks on a bus, and then the Montgomery County bus boycott. And it's a really long time that these people boycott the buses, and how much of an impact was it on their day-to-day lives? So when we talk about this resistance, it's not just one moment, it's over a long period of time, unbelievably affecting your job, your kids, your career, everything. So tell us a little bit about the boycott, and then we'll roll into the sit-in movement.
Yeah, so the Montgomery bus boycott, it emerges when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on December 1st, 1955. This is part of a broader strategy. Parks, again, herself is a longtime member of the NAACP, and Parks' arrest becomes a galvanizing force for the African-American community's challenge to segregated buses in Montgomery, one of the most segregated cities in the country. This boycott, it's African-Americans saying, we are not going to take the bus. And you're right, Curry, it takes a personal toll. Over a year. This boycott lasts for over a year, but it does spur some change in Montgomery, Alabama. But it's an important example of nonviolent direct action, using protest, using boycotts, using the different tools in a protester's arsenal to try to push for change in really deeply segregated cities.
And now he leads us perfectly to the sit-in movement. And so I deep dove down a rabbit hole the other day and I reread kind of all these pieces. And it's so unbelievably powerful to think of 4 students at college, freshman and sophomore, are talking about what's going on in the country in 1960. And they're seeing that change needs to happen. And they get up and they go to their local community that their college is, and they sit at a whites only counter. And this active resistance, putting their life on the line, putting their bodies in danger, sparks a huge movement that then is picked up by so many other people. And I love the story when we talk about, the youth leading this, when we talk about these main key players, but they pick up this idea, they pick up this action with Ella Baker and with others and say, let's do this. How do we all make a difference? And it's a very young movement. So I always go back to Diane Nash here and say, this is what Diane Nash did. And she helped push in these small communities, sit-in movements to push for change right in everybody's face. So tell us a little bit about the sit-in movements and how much effect they had on this and the tone of the courts and the tone of the presidency, because they're all connected.
Yes, yeah, so the sit-in movement, you're right, Corey, it's a powerful symbol. It emerges in 1960. It begins in Greensboro, North Carolina, again, with just young college students. I mean, imagine the courage. It's unbelievable. Then it spreads to other cities like Nashville, Atlanta, other major cities. And just to give an idea of what happens in a sit-in, I mean, it would be a student activist or activist. They enter a segregated public place like a grocery counter that you see here. They sit there in the whites only area. And then they're often surrounded by white mobs who they threaten them, harass them, often physically assault them. But what they're trying to do is demonstrate under the principle of nonviolence. It was meant to show and expose the violence required to uphold unjust Jim Crow laws. And so again, it's a use of nonviolent direct action to emphasize that we, the protesters, we are the nonviolent ones. We are on the side of good, and the mobs, the Jim Crow laws, they are on the side of constitutional evil.
Awesome. And next, freedom rides, which I think is unbelievably important. So we see the freedom rides begin in the early 60s. And so much of the video footage that you see, the film footage, I should say, because they didn't have videos back then, are the actual freedom riders' own teams collecting footage of it. So this is not typical that camera crews were taking images of freedom rides. What we see in those documentaries, they're all their own videos set up, but they're going into the Deep South. They're taking buses that are crossing state lines, and they're going into the Deep South, and their goal is to get people registered to vote. Again, taking their lives, putting them at risk to get the vote, to hear change. And this is unbelievably powerful. And we see pictures of John Lewis at 25 years old being attacked by mobs, why police officers in the community did not come to help them, save them, or show up, being attacked by mobs. And that's that classic video or image of John Lewis holding bloody rags to his face because of the violence that these freedom riders saw.
Yeah, so I mean, they begin in 1961. The Supreme Court said we need to desegregate interstate bus travel. The civil rights reformers saw that this was not happening. And so you're right, John Lewis and his allies in the civil rights movement, they board buses, they go into the South. And again, it's a reminder of the courage of these people as they're boarding these buses. They know that the likelihood of violence is so high, and yet they do it anyway. And we see, you're right, we see mob violence, we see buses bombed. And these images end up being beamed into households throughout the country and begin to, like many of these other pushes, begin to reshape opinion, especially in white households, of the evils that are happening in the Jim Crow South.
And and I know we have to wrap up in a minute, so I want to get to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act really quickly at the end for our students. But this leads us to probably one of the most violent confrontations between the nonviolent civil rights movement walking out of Selma, Alabama, and meeting a group, a sheriff's department at the end of the bridge, and this interaction. And right there is John Lewis and some key other figures that were pushing for voting rights. And almost a little bit of a shift going on too. You've got this shift where, people like Martin Luther King are saying, we need to push for federal change. We need to push for those Reconstruction amendments to kick in and Congress to do what they're allowed to do and to pass the Voting Rights Act and pass the Civil Rights Act. And then you see a shift of some of the other civil rights leaders saying we need to push harder and we are not going to be violent, but we're all going to break laws. And when they cross the bridge, they are breaking the law. But this ends in an unbelievable visual of violence. The media was there during this day, and we see millions of people watch it that night on TV, and the public opinion of the civil rights movement and the action that's needed starts to energize even more across, and you're right, Tom, white America as well, that something's going wrong here and we need to make change. So walk us from this kind of epic moment, this catalyst moment, to the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm actually going to just quickly focus on two big pieces of violence here. So in 1963, we see a mass demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the largest to date, and provokes nationally publicized police brutality against the protesters. So thousands of marchers protest employment discrimination in Montgomery, Alabama. Bull Connor, the city's police commissioner, orders the city's police to meet the marchers with violent force, and this includes snarling dogs, cattle prods, high-pressure fire hoses. All of this is caught on television. So this is a key pivotal moment that, again, ends up being beamed into households, reshaping public opinion, leads to one of the great tracts ever written in American political history by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who's later arrested. This is his letter from a Birmingham jail, which leads naturally into the March on Washington later that year, where Dr. King delivers his I Have a Dream speech. But the other, you're right, Curry, the other twin act of violence that becomes so important is this incident of Bloody Sunday that pushes for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Dr. King and the movement remain committed to voting rights, but many members of the movement say, no, we need another big act of nonviolent direct action. So civil rights leaders call for a march from Selma, Alabama to the Capitol in Montgomery. 600 marchers leave Selma. They cross the Edmund Pettit Bridge. They're met with troopers, assaulted by them with tear gas. In clubs, John Lewis, again, who you see in the picture there, would bear the scars of that moment for the rest of his life. Once again, it's caught on national television. And again, this act of courage reshapes public opinion. And these images and these pushes for reform lead to two huge pieces of civil rights legislation, two big laws: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ends up pushing broadly for equality in a lot of different settings, in employment, in accommodations, in restaurants, you name it. It's a broad, sweeping promise of equality. The Warren Court then upholds this law in a case known as Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States. And then we end up with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ends up being passed to enforce the 15th Amendment's promise to end racial discrimination in voting. It puts really strong constitutional mechanisms in place to check areas that have really lousy voting records for African Americans. The big part of this law is that if you have a bad record on African American voting, you have to go through a process known as pre-clearance, which means if you change a voting law, you have to come to the national government, and the national government can say yes or no to that new law. So this is really, really strong constitutional medicine. Traditionally in America, voting laws are set by state and local governments, but here Congress is using the power under the 15th Amendment to push for a big national law committed to ensuring African American voting rights. And again, the Warren Court steps in a case called South Carolina versus Katzenbach and says, yes, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it's a big new law. It does big things. It's strong constitutional medicine, but it's also constitutional. It's consistent with the 15th Amendment's promise of ending racial discrimination in voting. And finally, this law really, it works. It's an amazingly effective piece of legislation. Just a couple of stats. In 1960, only 20% of eligible African-American voters are registered to vote. By 1971, the number rises to 62%. At the same time, African-American elected officials quadruple from 1,400 in 1970 to 4,900 in 1980 and double again in the early 1990s.
And you know how I love data, Tom. So thank you for ending on like, look, it works. And we have a voting rights class coming up in a few weeks where we'll talk about this, and we'll continue to go in the storyline even further to talk about more cases around voting rights in modern day. So it doesn't end here in 1965. The conversation around voting rights continues, and we'll follow that up in the next class that we have in a few weeks. Tom, thank you so much for that. I have just 2 follow-up questions real quick, but with that, I'm going to stop this recording. Thank everybody so much. And, oh, nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Stop.